Okay, folks, so welcome to the Life in the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly dungeon muser this evening. Tonight, I am coming to you a night before our regular scheduled session for the Scales of War campaign that we've been playing for the last couple of months. Originally using the 4th edition rules for Dungeons and Dragons, and now using Robert Schwab's very cool Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign, or Shadow of the Demon Lord, I'm sorry, role-playing game. What I wanted to do is hop on. I had originally planned to pop on and give a quick summary of the 4 hours that we lost to the ether a few weeks ago, which was very frustrating, and I'm very hopeful that does not happen again. I'm actually going to bear with me a moment too, because we've had some difficulty with the ether a few. Oop, I can mute myself. Because we have lost a couple of actual sessions, or at least bits and pieces of it, I'm having to double check to make sure we're streaming properly. So I was going to provide a summary of what we had lost in those 4 hours. And then as I got to thinking about it, and knowing that we have only 5 more sessions of this game left, I thought it might be a useful opportunity to hop on and talk about what has happened in the campaign so far, if you haven't been watching from the get-go, to talk about what happened in the time that was missed, obviously, and then maybe provide some insight as to why I made the decision to switch from 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons to Shadow of the Demon Lord, and why I'm sort of accelerating this towards a conclusion. So first up, let me. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to use visual aids. So you're not looking at my mug for the duration of this video. I will hop on to Roll20, where I've got some visual aids prepped for you. So if you bear with me just a moment here, I'm going to log into that and do some jiggery pokery with my camera and get myself in a position so that I can actually share the screen with you. So maybe as background, the decision to run Scales of War originally, Scales of War, maybe let me take even one more step back. So Scales of War is a campaign that was originally published for the 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons back in about 2000, I think it was 2007 or 2008, like shortly after the launch of 4th edition. Let me swap over to the other screen here. Boom, look at that. Present to everyone. And let me see. I'm going to see if my camera will work in. It's not working because it's on my Google Plus call. I don't know why, but for some reason, I can't have a camera active in both Roll20 and Google Plus at the same time. I don't know why, but in any event. So this was originally published for D&D 4th edition, and I was a very big fan of 4th edition when it was in print. And I actually really liked I got to read the Scales of War campaign as it was published, and in particular the first 6 adventures I really, really enjoyed, including the second adventure, which was called The Siege of Bordrin's Rift. No, is that Bordrin's Watch, which was written by Robert Schwab, the author of Shadow of the Demon Lord. And there's in particular, there's a set piece right at the end of that adventure that I just love. I think it's a really cool idea, and that particular scene informed a lot of the encounter design that I used in 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons when I ran it. In particular, it made really effective use of terrain to make it a really dynamic and interesting setting. So because of that, I really wanted to I've always sort of had it as a white whale of mine that I wanted to try and run that campaign. So we were at the time playing Star Wars, I think. No, Star Wars had ended. We were playing the Conan role-playing game, and that didn't seem to quite jive. It wasn't. I really, really, really enjoyed that game, but the campaign we were running wasn't going great. So I canvassed with everyone if we could switch to 4th edition, and we did make the switch. And because the campaign was originally published for 4th edition D&D, that's what my thought was, and I had a lot of fun with 4th edition D&D back in the day when it was when it was in print. So in broad strokes, what the campaign is about is, as written, is this very, very long-term struggle against Tiamat. There's a thread that runs throughout the entire campaign arc, and the campaign, as written, runs you from level 1 all the way up to level 30. So the full, gamut of the levels that you have for 4th edition D&D. And for that, or the campaign, I should say, is set in this location you can see in the screen. This is the Elsir Vale. It doesn't only take place there, because it does take you to some other places, but this is where the first couple of adventures take place. And the campaign starts in a town called Brindle, which I'm just pinging here right in the middle. And the second adventure takes you to a place called Overlook. So because knowing that I wanted to bring the characters back to Overlook, I decided to start the characters in Overlook and give them a good in-character reason for being connected to Overlook. And for this particular campaign, we decided to do character creation together. Originally, what happened was we were going to make characters via email, and that very quickly went off the rails. And I'll tell you why. In 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, unlike in other versions of D&D, it's very important to have well, let me back up. In 4th edition D&D, unlike other versions of D&D, there are specific roles that characters play in the same way that, in a MMO, like, World of Warcraft, that characters have roles in a party. And when I say roles, I mean combat roles. There's a tank, someone or it's called a defender in 4th edition D&D. There's a defender who's there to sort of attract the attention of the bad guys and make sure that they're trying to, bang on them. There are healers, or leaders they call them, which are effectively healers. Everyone keeping everyone up. There are strikers, which are effectively DPS, or damage per second. They're there to do damage either in melee or at range. And there are controllers, who are characters who sort of alter the battlefield. And I had said to my players, there were 5 of them at first, and we added another one afterwards, that I really would like to see each of the different areas covered. There's lots of different options for character classes, and I'd like to see that. And then over the course of creating characters over email, I ended up with, I think it was 3 DPS classes, no healers, and 1 tank, which would have been a disaster for the campaign. So we decided to make characters all at once. And that one of the main benefits for that I found was that we ended up with some really interesting connections between the characters. And I'll introduce you to who these characters are right now. So these are the heroes who have been present throughout this campaign. There is a tiefling sorceress named Ember, who does not know who her parent is. Her demonic parent, I should say. Unlike other tieflings in Dungeons and Dragons, Ember took a background that effectively made it so that one of her parents was an actual, part of the infernal nobility in hell or in the abyss. And I didn't really, at the time, didn't know what that was going to be, and his Ember's player, James, didn't know what it was going to be, but he knew that he wanted to have this kind of mysterious connection there. So she became she wasn't a sorceress, she was a wizard. So Ember was going to be the wizard with this infernal, power. Halen Windspeaker was a elven monk, and I knew that in the campaign there was going to be, well, I guess my players won't. If you are, I'll just give a little caution here. I'm going to go into spoilers for the campaign, so if you're a player of mine, don't watch this, because at least not until the campaign is done, because this will spoil it for you. But what I can tell you, the listeners, is that the campaign features, at least for the first about 15 levels or so, maybe even 20 levels, the Githyanki, those astral, dwelling, kind of bizarre creatures. I honestly don't know if by canon they are human, but they're sort of like, they're presented as a race of human-like people, or humans who were taken by the Mind Flayers, by the Illithids, and then enslaved for centuries, if not millennia, if not whatever, and were changed by that experience, and then gained their freedom through a revolt, and then ended up splitting into 2 different people, the Githyanki and the Githzerai. And the Githyanki are the ones who are the enemy, sort of the big bad, for the first like 20 levels of Scales of War, and then you find out that it's actually Tiamat, and Tiamat is the queen of dragons, and there's a big plot, a complex thing that she is trying to achieve in her eternal struggle against her brother Bahamut, the good aligned god of dragons. It's important to know that's sort of the struggle, because the two of them were originally one god. One is the god of good dragons and other things, and the other one is the god of bad dragons and other things. But they were originally one single god called Io. And Io was split in two, cut in twain, as it were, by this primordial threat called, I believe, named the King of Terror. And that's I like that story, and I like that story element. So that's something we picked up early on. The campaign actually started with, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Forgive me. I'll finish introducing everybody. So Halen is from a special tribe of elves, sort of xenophobic, not xenophobic, I'm sorry, sort of like reclusive. They were never part of the broader elven society. And the reason was because they had trained in psionics, because a monk in 4th edition D&D is a psionic class. I decided to make anyone who is a psionic class have something special. They were trained as part of an order that dated back, past recorded or remembered time. That was important because another of our players, Jeff, was going to be playing. Halen is played by Brent, incidentally, and Oberon, who is a Minotaur Ardent, or was originally made as a Minotaur Ardent, and Ardent is a psychic leader class, so kind of like a healer, sort of like a cleric, but not, there's no god or deity involved. The Ardent uses emotional manipulation to sort of affect its healing abilities. So what I decided was that both of the psychic characters would come from similar sort of secretive, ancient orders. And the main link is that the language that their order speaks, their secret tongue, it's the same thing between the different orders. So it's sort of implied that both of the orders were trained by the same people. The training came from someone else. That stuff isn't in the published campaign. I just wanted to have something more meaningful for them to strive against the Githyanki when they encountered them, give a more personal basis for their fight against them. So Halen was now our second PC. Rackus Bloodhoof is played by Dave, and Rackus was a barbarian, and he was a type of barbarian in 4th edition D&D that actually works as a defender, so a tank. He could be the guy to get everyone to attack him, but it could also swap to become a DPS if necessary. There's a neat little function where it rages, and then it starts doing more damage rather than tanking. His brother was Oberon, the character played by Jeff. So we had the Bloodhoof brothers, and what they sort of came up with in the first session for character creation was that sort of Rackus is the boiling, tempest of emotion, and Oberon is his calming second presence because of his empathic abilities. He kept him calm and kept him from losing himself to his rage. In the 4th edition setting of D&D, the Minotaurs have sort of a backstory where they all hear the call of this demon lord named Baphomet. And if they fall to the call of Baphomet, they become these bestial, monstrous things, which is effectively like what the normal Minotaurs that you would encounter in any previous version of D&D, apart from Dragonlance, I guess. And then our final player was my cousin Corey. Cork was playing a weird kind of kid named Xavier, and Xavier just sort of appeared in Overlook in the city where this started one day. And he didn't really know his backstory, but he had some very weird white hair and these glowing golden eyes and a very mysterious, no recollection of where he was from, no parents that could be identified easily. And he was taken, because he was a kind of a street kid, Amber took him under her wing. One of the things we did when we were making characters in that first session was each character had to have some meaningful connection to the other characters. So Amber was the one who had sort of collected this misfit group of characters together to form a mercenary company to try and make a little coin and build something. One of the things I also did was steal an idea from my buddy Chadwick Ginther, who you can see on one of my tail or seat behind the screen videos. I talked to him about gaming and books there, but he had a really clever idea for one of his campaigns to explain player absences. And what it was that there was some kind of magical mishap that happened on the first session of one of his campaigns. And as a result of that, when a player wasn't there, the character, it just sort of faded into the ethereal plane. And I love that idea. I think it's a genius idea of explaining why a character's not there. You don't have to worry about another person playing that character, and you don't have to worry about. And actually, I guess, and it gives a really good story reason for to kick off the start of a session where someone was there before and then now isn't. You see this character fade out, and now the players who are attending, they've got to deal with a sudden change, right? So I love that, and I took that idea, and the way I implemented it was before the first session, we saw that, or we decided that the characters were all, they were all sort of like scrambling to try and get a job, beg, borrowing and trying to steal the opportunity to impress the local, very powerful merchant guild, which is known as the Elves Consortium. They did get a job. They escorted some people out to look at this mining colony or mining settlement that seemed to have gone silent. They went there. They found this big, weird ring that seemed to have writing on it that both Halen and Oberon recognized from their respective orders. So it was written in some kind of weird, ancient script, and it gave off, or it emitted this weird sonic kind of energy as well. The next thing the guys remember is the flash of light, and the two merchants that they escorted there were killed as a result of this. So because of the death of the merchants, they were effectively blacklisted by the Elves Consortium. That's the reason they couldn't stay in Overlook, because if the Elves Consortium doesn't want you working, you're not working. And you're not working for any job that you would reasonably take, but the ones that they might take would be so dangerous or so irresponsible or so unlikely to pay them that it's not even worth considering. So the characters talked about it, and then they heard about a place called Restwell Keep that was pretty far away, about a month's travel to the east. And they decided, you know what, we're going to go there, we're going to make a name for ourselves, and then we'll come back home, and then we'll show them. So the characters decided to set off. Now, you may notice that I have 6 player characters listed here, but I've only talked about 5 of them. The reason is because we had someone else, one of our regular players from our other campaign, Steve, joined the Scales of War campaign fairly late, about 3 or 4 sessions in. And he decided he wanted to play a elven rogue. So basically what I just said was, because there wasn't any backstory baked in about him yet, is that he's always been there. He was always part of their group, but after the magical catastrophe that causes them to fade in and fade out, he faded out, and they effectively forgot about him. But as soon as he returned, then they started getting their memories back about this guy, and the original session where he was introduced, we got to do some fun role playing where they were thinking like, how could I have forgotten Newtay? So Newtay was a street urchin living in Overlook as well, who was an elf who grew up without his kin. His connection ended up being to Halen as sort of the two misfit elves, although Newtay always thought that Halen was a little weird as far as elves go because of his unique sort of, psionic background. So anyway, our 6 heroes set out, I'll bring you back to the map here, from Overlook. So here's Overlook here. Overlook happens to sit on the eastern side, I believe it's called the Giant Shield? No, the Giant Shield's on the other side. Stoneholm, I think, is what they're called, the Stoneholm Mountains. And Stoneholm Mountains serve as a bulwark against these, as you can see in the map here, the Orc Country. This place where the countless hordes of orcs fight amongst each other, and, of every 10 years or so will organize themselves sufficiently or spawn to have such numbers that they decide to try and test their mettle against the dwarven people, or the dwarven fortresses that watch over the paths through the Stoneholm Mountains. And it had been about a decade since that had happened, but without that happening, without the need for any able person who can swing a sword to pick up and be thrown against these hordes, There really wasn't any work in Overlook, so the characters set out. And what I had done in the outset was, again, we're playing with 4th edition D&D at that point. Characters set out, and I had concocted this very elaborate set of travel rules that I had adopted from the Middle-earth Adventures in Middle-earth game, which is effectively a conversion of the One Ring role-playing game published by Cubicle 7. That was effectively the newest Lord of the Rings role-playing game. Adventures in Middle-earth was an adaptation of that game and those mechanics to 5th edition D&D. So I had come up with all these ideas for it to try and make the travel more real and, make the feeling of hiking through mountains feel more real. It turned out there were 2 problems with that. Is for one, we were playing Adventure Path, which had set story beats and had sort of an XP arc that would get you to certain levels by certain points. And if you outpaced the levels by getting too much XP, then it would kind of screw up the challenges for all the adventures going forward. The other thing is that, so because of that, I was just not granting, I was doing a milestone advancement where they just reached a certain level once they had reached a certain point of the adventure. The trouble is because the travel rules were so elaborate, we were spending session after session after session with them on the road, traveling from Overlook to Brindle, where the campaign was going to kick off. So I think we spent, it's about 5 or 6 sessions. And we had some really good stuff happening during that, and I think it helped set some of the backstory for the game. Like, for instance, they learned about the history of the region, where 200 years ago there was this kingdom called the Kingdom of Restalor, and you can see right in the center of the map here where I'm pinging, there is a kingdom or a city, or it's just nothing now. There are ruins, but it was a city called Rest, and it was the head of this kingdom. But the characters heard about how the Kingdom of Rest was attacked by a horde of hobgoblins, which happens fairly frequently in the Elsevier Vale. They're not being bedeviled by orcs from the west. They're seeing hobgoblin hordes come down from either the Wyrmsmoke Mountains or from the Giant Shields. And one of those hordes attacked the Kingdom of Rest. And had it not been for the betrayal of the kingdom by one of its noble families, the Villicus family, who were said to be necromancers as well, then the kingdom would have been able to fight off this horde. But unfortunately, because of the betrayal, the kingdom was weakened to the point that it collapsed shortly afterwards. The upside, I guess, or the happy sort of appendage to the, or addition to the story or sub-story is that the Villicus family was subsequently betrayed by the Horde, and legend held that they were mostly annihilated, and then those that were not, the surviving nobility of the falling Kingdom of Rest, they all showed up at their ancestral home of Rivenroar and effectively reduced the entire place, killed all the remaining Villicus members or the Villicus people they could find, and then reduced Rivenroar to ruins. The next thing, so they were hearing about this partly through people they were meeting on the road, partly through different things they were seeing along the way as well too. One other tidbit of history they learned about was the attack of the Red Horde, or the Horde of the Red Hand, which was about 20 years ago, or 20 years prior to the campaign. It was the last time this big hobgoblin army had sort of gotten together and threatened the Elsevier Vale. During that attack, it was led by a hobgoblin, or half hobgoblin, half dragon general named Azar Cool, which was pretty cool. I mean, to be honest, the backstory was taken from a adventure, something of the Red Hand. I honestly don't remember what the name of the adventure is, but it's a 3rd edition D&D adventure. Attack of the Red Hand, Threat of the Red Hand, something like that. Anyway, this particular campaign was written to be sort of a spiritual successor to that very cool campaign. It didn't quite work out the same in that way in play, but that's, that was the idea. So the backstory was there was a history of these hobgoblin hordes attacking the different kingdoms. There was this necromancer family, and as the players were traveling along, they were encountering goblins, and each of the goblins had very crude replicas of this sort of red hand markings in their, or sigils, as their sort of, signs, or their way of their iconography on their shields and on their armor and stuff like that. So they got the sense that there were these disorganized goblin groups that seemed to be imitating or aping that horde from about 20 years ago that was led by Azar-Kul. Now, Azar-Kul being a half-dragon, the reason that's important is because he was a priest, or a worshiper at least, of Tiamat. And that would, play a fairly important role in the adventure as written. So the players finally reached Brindle, and after reaching Brindle, which is, I'll ping that so you can see in case the map is hard to read. Brindle was the sort of biggest city, and in the original Red Hand adventure, the 3rd edition one, that was where basically the high tide of Azar-Kul's invasion happened. And the players knew already, because they had met NPCs and whatnot, and heard about how there were heroes of Brindle that had defeated the first Horde of the Red Hand. So they arrive there, and they show up, and they go and meet with the barkeep that they were told to meet with, that was recommended to them from way back in Overlook. And their thought was just to, drop in and then carry on their way. Their original ultimate destination was going to be about, another another 2 weeks or so travel further to the east. But the first night they get in, they were attacked by hobgoblins. Hobgoblins, a whole army attacked Brindle. And there's a really fun couple of sessions where we were playing through the characters sort of racing around, engage in combat with these attacking hobgoblins. There was a really fun encounter in the opening scene of the first adventure in the Scales of War adventure path called Rescue at Rivenroar, where they're the first sort of enemy they fight once they... it's not true, it's one of the first guys they fight, is this wagon that is strapped to a ogre that has 2 hobgoblin archers in the back, and then it's also replete with these casks of oil that the ogre will pick up and throw as bombs. So it's a pretty cool image, and it makes for a pretty fun encounter. The players, of course, immediately blew up all the drums of oil, which was amazing. And then we had this really fun couple sessions where they basically ran through the streets trying to save as many people as they could and kill as many hobgoblins as they could. Because of their heroics, the next day when the hobgoblin army retreated, they were approached by the town council, who asked them to, because they were so successful in the first sort of efforts or their efforts to drive off the horde that had attacked them, they wanted to hire them to go and rescue some people who had been kidnapped, because the hobgoblins had retreated with a bunch of people. In addition, the hobgoblins had retreated with some relics that were kept in the Hall of Valor. And what those relics were mementos, effectively, of the heroes who had protected Brindle 20 years earlier. So the heroes quickly agreed to that. They went and interrogated a captive hobgoblin who the town was planning to put on trial and then hang, because they wanted to show that they were... there's a distinction between civilization and the brute force of the hobgoblins. So they interrogated them, and they found out that the new head of the Red Hand is this hobgoblin named Sinrith, who has unholy allies in Rivenroar, and that they were based out of the ruins of Rivenroar. So the players already knew that this was the former home of the Villicus family. They knew that this was likely, that you knew that the Villicus family was notorious for necromancy. So they knew probably they were facing some kind of, undead spellcasting characters, as well as a whole army of hobgoblins. So the characters agreed that they would take on this job, and they set out into the wild to try and track down find Rivenroar, and then somehow effect a rescue of these people, and if they can, to recover the relics that were kept in the Hall of Valor. So the characters set out, and we're still playing 4th edition D&D at that point. And I honestly don't remember if there were any combat encounters, at least along the way, but there was a brief encounter with a flooded stream. And the characters, to be honest, it was a much less it was a much less exciting encounter than I had anticipated it being. I had in my head that this was going to be a really fun, man versus the wild kind of thing, and I think they found it more a pain in the ass than anything else. It just felt like an unnecessary impediment, and I recognized that, and it was one of the reasons that led me to change the game that we were going to be running. We ran the last session we ran with 4th edition D&D was when the characters arrived at Rivenroar, and the characters did a quick reconnoitering out to see where everything was, and it turned out, luckily for them, that there was most of the army all camped in one place, and these are thousands of hobgoblins and orcs, and no, sorry, there were no orcs. It was hobgoblins and ogres and some minotaurs and goblins and bugbears, and just it was a terror. But fortunately, it seemed that Sinrith was keeping his abode was in the crypt underneath Rivenroar, where the remnants, the undead survivors of the Villicus family, where they were located as well. And because of the undead and sort of the weird, heebie-jeebies that come with being close to them, the army didn't want to camp on top of those ruins. So the characters had a pretty easy job of sneaking their way into the crypts. Now, before we ran our first combat encounter in the dungeon, that's when I made the decision to make the switch from 4th edition D&D to Shadow the Demon Lord. And in the past, with my particular gaming group that I play with, and we've played together for many years, we've done stuff like this, where I'll run what's called a war story session, or what I call a war story session, which is where we will run something that sometimes uses it will use different characters. Sometimes it uses a different game, and it's used to sort of, as a pressure valve for my wandering eye to want to dabble with other games. So it's a chance to just play, with other games, and for the players to try something different as well. And a way for us to introduce some story elements that in a more interesting way than just giving them, what do you call it, exposition. So they were no strangers to suddenly being switched over, but I was seeing that there were a bunch of things that were not working in the campaign. One of them was my Fakakta travel rules. They were just they did not fit. I don't think that the rules themselves were bad. What was bad was that this was not this particular campaign is not a sandbox campaign. It is a adventure path. It has a clear narrative of what's happening in the game, what it's about, what the story is about, and by using those travel rules, what it was doing was muddying the narrative, and also making it frustrating for some of the players who just wanted, they wanted to see their characters level up. Because I was using that milestone and I was linking the milestone to the story part, they kept having to do stuff and encounter things, and they weren't really getting any tangible benefits. They were getting money, and they were getting, little disposable or consumable items and things like that. And I thought that would be sufficient reward, but it wasn't. And as I said, the reason I couldn't just let the characters level up was because it would have screwed up the overall adventure path, because I would have had to rejig all of the different encounters going forward for the next, whatever it was, 20 adventures. So that was one of the reasons. Is the travel rules were just a terrible idea of incorporating them into the game. The other thing is that when I played D&D 4th edition before, I had run it for about 2.5 years with mostly the same group of guys. But at the time, we had just finished our degrees. We weren't about to start working. So a lot of us were just, to be honest, just kind of fucking around on the weekends. So, one of our players, his wife was living in another city at the time because of education. So he had weekends free all the time. And the other two of us had very understanding girlfriends at the time. So we were playing, like 16-hour sessions on Saturdays. It was a really great time. But because of that, because of being able to do that and play in person, we were able to really grasp the rules and get into the nitty-gritty tactical aspect of D&D 4th. And I could help the players who were not as, gamist-minded as maybe what I was, to help them with the rules and help them to maximize their characters. That's a lot harder to do online. There's some advantages that we have with Roll20 because we were playing this campaign over Roll20. One of the advantages to it was that is that you can make really great maps and great tokens very easily in Roll20. The downside is by not playing on at the same table together with a very nitty-gritty tactical game, it's hard to help those players out who haven't taken the time to learn the game really, really well. So as a result, and also there were some players who just did not grasp that they had certain roles that their characters were intended to play, and by not playing those roles, it was making things a lot harder for the rest of the group. We had quite a few near deaths early in the campaign just because the tank would go one direction, the healer would go in another one, the DPS would go off in another direction, and so forth. And in that particular game, it was that's a surefire way of having a bad time, because you're not really playing properly. It's not a wrong way to have fun, but there is certainly a wrong way to play something to its tactical strengths. So for that reason, I thought that the tactical elements of D&D 4th were just not going to be a good fit. And the other thing was, I'm not sure if there was another reason. Well, actually, and the other reason was that one of the alternatives I thought of was Shadow of the Demon Lord, which I had been running for about a year and a bit then, and which I loved. I thoroughly enjoyed that game. It is one of my absolute favorite role-playing games of all time. If you're listening to this, you're likely familiar with the other sessions, but I do have a fairly extensive review of Shadow of the Demon Lord, the core book, on the channel, and maybe I'll link that in the description of this video. So if you do want to learn more about that particular game, you can link through to that. But the main reason I thought that the Shadow of the Demon Lord game would be a good fit is, for one, it can be fairly tactical, so there would still be a lot of that there. I could translate faithfully over every single one of the characters that was in the game, including some of the weirder, forgive me, some of the weirder classes like the Ardent and the 4th edition Monk. I could convert those over and make a good simulation or version of those characters in Shadow of the Demon Lord. And I thought it would be fun to play up. I'm always a DM who likes to lean into the sort of horror or the dark fantasy aspect when I run games, because I love that stuff. And I cut my teeth primarily in my teens playing Call of Cthulhu an awful lot. So I love horror stuff. And Shadow of the Demon Lord felt like it would be a good way to play up those horror aspects. I also felt it was pretty easy to convert. Like, Shadow of the Demon Lord is very easy to sort of fudge on the fly. So for that reason, too, it was going to be easy to convert over all the adventures. And at the time, I was intending to still run through the rest of the adventure path. So we did that. When we started the dungeon crawl, and their heroes started trying to make their way through the catacombs under Rivenroar, we were playing Shadow of the Demon Lord. And after one session, one other thing I should mention as well, too, is one of the things I had sort of realized as well is that getting the core book in the hands of my players, a physical copy of it, would be a really easy way for them to engage in one of my favorite aspects of Shadow of the Demon Lord, which is the mixing and matching that you can do with the different paths. In that game, classes are effectively they're called paths, and you get to make a decision for 3 of them. You get your novice path, your expert path, and your master path. And then there's a bunch of other decisions you get to make as you level your character up. But it means that there's a lot of fun, mixing and matching you can do. There's also, for spells, there's 30 different traditions of spells, and each of those has like 11 different spells. There's a massive array of spells you can choose from too, which for my players would clearly give them some fun things to think about when they're leveling up their character. The other thing is I wanted to see the characters level up faster. And in Shadow of the Demon Lord, the way that the game is intended to be played, or at least is recommended to be played at default, is that you play 11 adventures, and that takes you from level 0 to level 10. And it's a complete campaign in the course of those 11 adventures. So I had mentioned that stuff, and for that, I could set specific milestones and see the characters go up at a clear rate. So they would be able to see a game, or a set of characters go from beginning to end game in the course of one campaign, because I've never done that. The closest I've come has been a Iron Kingdoms campaign, Iron Kingdoms role-playing game campaign that lasted with many of the same players that I have in my current game. Many of them, they were about 20 or 30 XP off from endgame, and that campaign just sort of fizzled out. So we were very close before. So with this campaign, that was the other selling point, is we get to see the entire life cycle of the characters. So we played a session, and it was a massive hit. Everyone loved the copies of the core book that I sent to them. I either delivered them in person for Steve, who lives in town, or I mailed it out to all my other players, and that was a very wise investment. I've had a lot of fun with this particular campaign since then, and everyone seems to really love Shadow the Demon Lord. So I'm very happy with that. So the story continued under Riven Roar, but I decided to make some changes and try to play up sort of the shadow domain and the links between some of the characters or links between some of the different adventures. And one of the downsides for the Scales of War adventure path is that you do have to do a fair amount of work to connect the different adventures to each other. And the reason I think that the connections are not particularly strong is because there was not a strong editorial hand at the rudder, which meant that some of the adventures have kind of varying degrees of quality to them, but it's not clear from the first adventure where the story will end. And I don't think that they necessarily knew either, which meant that there are developments later in the campaign that retroactively you realize, reading through all of them, that this should have come up much earlier, but in the adventures as written did not. In addition, so that was one of the things I needed to change. There were 2 online resources that were really helpful for that, for people who had run this campaign before and the changes they had made. So I stole those ideas. One of the other things I changed was that I really wanted to play up in the 3rd or 4th adventure. I think it's the 3rd adventure. It takes the characters to this other plane, to the Shadowfell. And the Shadowfell in 4th edition D&D is sort of like this, mirror plane. It's very close to the prime material plane, but what it features is this like shadowy reflection, and it's populated by a couple of different races, including this weird, like, kind of goth, like hyper pierced race of sort of elf-looking characters called the Shadar Kai, and these things called Dark Creepers, which are the Creepers, or the Dark Creepers, have been part of D&D or AD&D since the Fiend Folio, which was published in the 80s. So it's a character that's been around or a monster that's been around for a long time. But I never owned the Fiend Folio when I was a kid, so some of those weirdo monsters that are in that book I was not familiar with, and I don't associate really with D&D. And the first time I encountered them was in 3rd and 4th edition, and I didn't like them. I think I just don't like them. I don't think they're very interesting. I don't think they're very flavorful. And the Shadow Kai feel very 90s to me. So they use lots of like tight leather and like chains and spikes and shit like that. And it doesn't feel sinister or whatever. It just feels silly. What I think they intended was to give it kind of a Hellraiser sort of feel, but really what it felt like to me was like industrial goth night at my bar when I was in my 20s. So what I decided to do was to change the Shadow Kai and the Dark Creepers to be elves, to be twisted elves instead, and call them the Shadow Elves, because in basic D&D there was a race called the Shadow Elves that were sort of the main adversary for the elves, the surface elves in that campaign. So I kind of like that. And in a Unearthed Arcana that was published for 5th edition D&D, they had sort of reinvented the Shadow Kai as being a subset of the elves, and I thought that was a genius move. I loved that. So instead, I got these Shadow Elves who live in the Shadow Plane. The reason I mention that is because in Shadow the Demon Lord, there are firearms. Firearms are part of the setting, and there's also a school of magic, a tradition of magic called technomancy. So you can make cool things like giant robot suits and giant, or you can cast a spell on a giant crossbow will appear that's kind of a mechanical thing, or like a turret, and it'll fire at your enemies for you. So because of that sort of technological bent, I decided to use that as my elves. So where most elves would go towards, forest and nature and the Feywild and primal magics and stuff like that, the shadow elves, they went an industrial bent, where the other elves would be chaotic good, as far as the traditional D&D alignments would be. The shadow elves would be lawful evil. They're creatures who are selfish, who are self-interested, who though follow a strict, orderly, mindset. They will try and take advantage of their allies and whatnot, or their allies, and get one over on their enemies, but they will do it within lawful means. And I think that mindset would also lend itself towards more technology. Picture like, pale skinned, elven robber barons. That's sort of what I was thinking of these guys as, this shadowy world full of, all the nightmares of the industrial revolution. So the worst sort of caricatures of 19th century London. That's sort of what I was picturing the Shadow Elves being like. And the characters, as they explored Rivenroar, they encountered and defeated Sinrith, but Sinrith had this very powerful shadow magic that he was using. And that was a gift from the Shadow Elves. The players have not uncovered that yet, but they did recover a pretty powerful artifact called the Shadow Staff. And as is appropriate for Shadow the Demon Lord, it is something that can exact a very high toll from the caster who takes advantage of this weapon, mainly in the form of corruption, where the character's soul itself is twisted towards evil. They also defeated Villicus, the Lord Simon, or Baron's, I can't remember if it was Baron or Lord. I think it was Lord Simon Villicus, who was the undead caster who had betrayed the Kingdom of Rest. Our heroes faced him, and he finally saw justice after 200 years. On top of that, our heroes rescued almost all of the people who had been kidnapped, and they got a bunch of great loot. They also found a bunch of interesting magical stuff too, including this weird mechanical sphere that the players have not figured out was crafted by the Shadow Elves. They found some technomancy magic as well, that again, they still have not quite put two and two together to realize it's from the Shadow Elves, but that's okay. And they also, what else did they do? Jeez, they also found a note written in a weird script, but in the Elvish language, that was a letter to Sinrith encouraging him to attack Brindle. And the players have not, I don't think, again, haven't quite put two and two together that this is the Shadow Elves who were manipulating things. So after effecting the rescue, the characters decided to make their way back to Brindle. Along the way, they went to go and, as they were fleeing, they decided to rest and let the refugee, or the people they had rescued, let them catch their breath, get a rest, and then be able to travel in, because these travel the rest of the way to Brindle, because they had the shit kicked out of them by the hobgoblins. Many of them had been tortured or otherwise traumatized, so they needed a good rest. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is they picked a cave where this giant ape was sleeping, something that has been known as the Thundering Beast of the Cave since then. And that was a pretty funny encounter to design, because it came from one of our players who had a typo on his phone when he was trying to say gorilla, like guerrilla tactics, like the secretive warriors, and instead put gorilla. So after a series of jokes at his expense, I decided to have a gorilla in the session, so they were ambushed by a giant gorilla. They then finished their trip to Brindle, though they were attacked by, and this is actually bringing us right up to this last session. In the last session, they left the cave. The Rakus, the big black furred minotaur, he skinned the beast's hide because he wanted to make something with it. Oh, and one of the relics they recovered, I should mention as well too, was this silver sword. And the silver sword had this weird writing on it that was actually angelic script. So there was this angelic script, and I would have to actually go back and watch it. I think that it had a word written in the language of Oberon and Halen's respective orders, the two psychic characters. I was still, even though I switched games, I still kept that theme and that sort of backstory going. So they recovered this, and then as they were traveling back, Arrakis began to have dreams about this white-skinned minotaur, white-furred minotaur with brilliant blue eyes. And he sort of had this prophetic dream of the attack. There was there was a storm cloud that was coming towards his village. There was a wave of tornadoes that was coming towards him. And he heard the screams of dragons and the bellowing of their fire breath as they were flying towards in the hidden by the storm front that was approaching him in the dream. And astride them were these pale gray creatures. For those listening at home, and they're Githyanki, but I wanted to make the Githyanki a more alien and unpredictable race. I mean, the Githyanki in D&D, to me, were never particularly threatening because they just look kind of silly. I mean, they're these spindly, kind of yellowy with spots creatures, and like they're written just fine. But they run around in little loincloths, and they use these silly swords, and they've got these weird head like top knot things, and I just always found them to be kind of silly. So I wanted to get away from what because I'm the DM, I would be presenting them. I would be feeling they would be kind of foolish. I decided to sort of reskin them as much as I could. So I was using other names for them, like the Enemy or the Unshackled, and then I gave them a name of the Githyn Kai. So the players who are familiar with it could be like, oh, I know what that is, but that also gives me an opportunity to subvert their expectations with it, because if they think they know about the Githyn Kai because they know about the Githyanki, they are going to be in for a bit of a surprise. So that is that's sort of what they learned and what they recovered from Riven Roar on the way back, and then they got back to Brindle. So our heroes indulged in some downtime activities. Shadow of the Demon Lord has some very loose and very random, random encounter oriented downtime rules, which can be a lot of fun. But I had been reading at the time a lot of Pathfinder, and in the Pathfinder book, Ultimate Intrigue, there's a really cool set of rules for how to structure sort of not necessarily downtime, but downtime. The downtime rules for Pathfinder are found in the Ultimate campaign. So using some of the fun rules for downtime from 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the ones that were published in Volo's Guide, and adapting those things, synthesizing them and adapting them for Shadow of the Demon Lord. And what I was going to do is then use that as sort of a structure for the campaign as well, is that the characters, in addition to playing through the story, they would start being able to, curry favor with different organizations and, do tasks for them and meet some random NPCs and stuff like that. And that was around the time when I had the realization that I wanted to run something different. And I'll finish giving you a summary of what happened there, and then I'll transition to talk about what my decision was, or why I decided to make the switch. So after the guys got back, that they were intending to do some downtime events, but I had already decided that I wanted to speed the campaign up a bit and get to a resolution a little faster. So we dealt with some of the downtime issues beforehand, and then we only role played a handful of them. I was going to give them many more opportunities to play through some downtime, but I wanted to speed things up. So we did some downtime. They went around, they met some people, and one of the most important people they met was this money changer. And he was this guy, I can't remember what his name was. His name was something silly. It was like Wayne or something like that. Like it was a bad joke that unfortunately stuck. So Wayne, the money lender, actually I think that might have been his name. He agreed to buy all the different assortment of coinage that they had recovered from Riven Roar, and then converted over into something they could spend at the stores. So the characters did that, and then Brent, playing Halen, he wanted to learn more about his order, so he went out searching for. Well, actually, it wasn't specifically that he was looking for. He was looking for someone to craft these incantations, which are kind of like scrolls in Shadow of the Demon Lord, because no one in the party could craft them for him. So he went off looking for this, specifically for someone from the Soul tradition. And what I decided to do is to sort of give some more information about the broader campaign, because I wanted to accelerate things. So he met this blind dwarf who said that he was part of a dwarven order that was sort of an analog to the Elven order that Halen was a member of, and the Minotaur order that Oberon was a member of. So we got to learn a little bit more about the enemy, about the Githam Kai, and stuff like that from this character, and he was able to buy his stuff. And we spent the last hour of the session playing through this very interesting. Well, I had fun with it because it was different from what we normally do. And what it was the characters were accused by this one ambitious member of the town council, because remember, they were hired by the town council originally, and the guy who sort of ran the town council, he was sort of, after the heroes got back and rescued the refugees, the people who were, or refugees, the kidnappees or hostages, when they returned, he was sort of using that to the member of the town council to bolster his own esteem, both in Brindle as a whole, but also on the council. So this other, one of his rivals, picked up on this accusation that was advanced by two women and corroborated by Wayne, the moneylender or money changer, that they had, our heroes had brought back a bunch of stuff that belonged to people, that they knew belonged to people, and they sold it rather than returning it to them. And our heroes were rightfully pissed off at this and were outraged at this accusation. And then when Wayne came in and told them that he supported them, or that they had pressured him into buying this stuff, they were, they were in a bit of a bind. They managed to get 2 days to try and clear their names before the town council would pass judgment on them. And it was sounding like they were going to be ending up at the end of a tight rope with a noose around their neck. So one of the ways that this happened about an hour before the session ended, and I really didn't want it to spill over into another session. So I decided to try and steal an idea from another game, from Blades in the Dark, which really does a great job of expediting some of the things that can really bog down other games, like planning operations or planning sort of like heists or things like that. Blades in the Dark gives some great mechanics and great suggestions for how to speed through those things. So what I decided to do was I reminded my players of this Latin phrase, which is cui bono. And cui bono effectively means who profits. And my understanding is that it's something that dates back to the Roman era, and it was a way that investigators would approach a crime. They would think of, all right, this is what has happened, so cui bono, who profits from this? We can understand who profits from this. That will help help us figure out who may have done this. And I kept reiterating that to the players, and I think that it did a good job of focusing their efforts on trying to unravel this mystery. Because without that sort of reminder and that lens through which they were conducting their investigation, they may have spun their wheels a little bit and sort of forgotten what they were doing. So in the span of an hour, we managed to go through at a fairly brisk pace this investigation. And what it turned out is that the two women who had accused them in the first place, these two women were from houses that were burned to the ground in the attack by the hobgoblins. And there were bodies found in there, but they're claiming to have survived that. So they cornered good old Wayne, the money changer, and they intimidated him. And he managed to cough up that he was forced to do it by these two women because they weren't human. They were something unnatural, and they could change their shapes. So the guys had a bit of a discussion about that, about what they could do with him, and maybe he could just clear their name. But they were concerned that without any corroborating evidence, it would just be more of he said, she said, and that they rightfully pointed out that the town council would likely, or the ambitious councilor, would likely just point out that, well, no, you just pressured him again, and now he's saying what you want to do because you're threatening him. So what was decided was that they would instead leak to the town council that he was going to give different evidence. He was going to recant his accusations, and then they set up an ambush for these shapeshifters in his room. And because our heroes are quite freaking powerful at this point, we really sort of rushed through this in a narrative way, rushed through the encounter where the these two shapeshifters arrived and tried to kill Wayne. And why, the heroes managed to capture these things, and it turns out they were doppelgangers. And doppelgangers are a signature villain or a monster from D&D who can change shapes at will. And these things they said that they were part of, they said something in Elvish that spoke of, to the Elvish characters, that spoke of effectively like a return of the shadow. The shadow will fall again. That had double meanings. It partly had a meaning because we're playing Shadow of the Demon Lord as our the engine driving our campaign, and also it spoke to the Shadow Elves. And it was a legend that the Shadow Elves. I actually improv this in the session because I hadn't thought it through before, but I loved it, and it is one of the reasons why I love sometimes just like letting things come out at the table. I improv this whole scene about how there was a cataclysm, this thing called the Sundering. And when the Sundering occurred, the elves, knowing, having powerful magics that could foretell this, they decided to flee and survive it. And the way the most of the elves went is they went to the Feywild, or they went to the arcane realms. And then while they were there, waiting out the after effects of the Sundering, they were changed. And that's why certain elves are very, forest oriented and leaning towards primal natures, and why some elves, like high elves or Eladrin in 4th edition D&D, why they have more of a magical bent than the others. Well, what I decided is that there's also the Shadow Elves. What they were was they fled to the Shadowfell, but they were the only elven race that did not return, and that's because they were forced to. For one thing, they could not hear the call of their gods anymore, and because the Shadowfell is a dark and dreary place, and no elven god would want to ever turn its ear in that direction, never mind visit them. So they were forced to basically develop their own culture, their own society, and they are this atheist. Well, not atheist because gods exist. It's not something you can dispute in D&D, but they don't follow any gods. They don't worship any gods, and they develop this technology instead. And that this was part of their plot to return. What the characters have found subsequently is that the elves, at least, is that the doppelgangers are known to be or said to be agents of the Shadow Elves. And when they are defeated, for one thing, they're immune. They're terrifying things. They're sort of like the boogeymen of elven myths because they can appear as anybody. They are completely immune to any kind of scrying magics. You can't read their minds. You can't detect them other than when they're killed. And when they die, they dissipate into this like cloud of oily black smoke, and leaving only kind of a smudge behind. So they disappear without a trace, effectively, as well too. So they're very scary beings, and that's what the context was for when our heroes got word that Overlook was looking for mercenaries, anybody who could wield a sword to get their butts back to Overlook, because the orcs are coming. Oh, and one thing that happened during the session as well too was that they got on good with a local member of the Elseer Consortium. And you may remember that the Elseer Consortium is the group that they were wanting to get back in the good graces of in the first place, the big, powerful merchant guild based out of Overlook. So with the letter of reference from the local member of the Elseer Consortium in hand, or in one hand, and then the call to arms in the other hand, our heroes decided to set out for Overlook. And that's where we ended that session. So that's where we are right now. In the interim between, we have done a lot of sort of downtime role playing on or by email, where I've either answered questions that the players have about specific things, like trying to do research on the Shadow Elves or research on the Githyn Kai or whatever. There's also been some more dreams that Rakis has had with this silver sword. There's a whole sort of side story that happened there, but it didn't actually happen on camera last time anyway, so you're not missing anything by me not mentioning it. But I didn't, for those emails though, I did not include everybody. I sent it to specific groups of players. So like 2 of them would receive one email, and then one of them and then another 2 would get another email. so that I'm sort of spreading the information or the backstory around. And not all the players were able to, or were interested, I guess, possibly in responding, but almost all of them were. Almost everyone did really kind of like that way of doing a little bit of between session role playing. And what I'm hoping for the next session is that our heroes, or the players, I should say, will use that information and have it come out in player character. So it will be an at the table bit of surprise for some of the players. Like, only one of the players knows about the doppelgangers, about the story about them. So that's going to be pretty cool. And only one of them knows about, or only two of them know an awful lot about the Giffen Kai. So that's going to be pretty interesting too, as they meet some things. And then one of the other players, the player James, who plays Ember has finally heard from her father. And to be honest, when we started the campaign, I had no idea who her father was going to be. I knew that I wanted to do some creepy, some creepy sort of suggestions or like foreshadowing of who this person might be, but I didn't have anyone in mind. And then once I made the decision that I was going to wrap up this campaign in a more timely fashion, it was easy to figure out who I wanted it to be, because it fit physiologically well and it fit thematically well, and I figured a way to sort of tie it into the way I'm going to wrap up the campaign as well. So that's where we left our session, and that's what will be coming up tomorrow night. Tomorrow night is going to be our next session for this, and it will be a reskinned version of the Siege of Bordrin's Watch. Maybe what I'll do now is I'm going to log out of Roll20, and I'll switch back to the camera because I don't really need this visual aid for the next session here. Whoops, that's my logout screen. I'm sure that's terribly interesting for you. Stop sharing screens. There we go. And I'm back. So that's what's happened in the campaign so far. We've been slowly boiling towards this final conclusion. So one of the things that has happened in the interim between when we were playing last time and when I made the decision to start accelerating the campaign and to wrap it up rather than continue on, was the announcement of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And that had a couple of consequences for me. Is, for one, I had already been looking back at my Pathfinder stuff for some ideas for doing downtime and for doing wilderness travel and stuff like that, from books like the Ultimate Campaign Guide, or Ultimate Campaign, from Ultimate Intrigue, and Ultimate Wilderness, which was a fairly recent release at the time of recording. And the more I looked through those, the more I was really kind of, I remembered why I liked some aspects of Pathfinder when I had read it before. I had not run Pathfinder extensively. I'd run a handful of sessions here and there, and I'd played a fairly short campaign with it, but it wasn't really something that I had run on a regular basis or run an awful lot. So with the announcement of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, it got me nostalgic for Pathfinder, and Pathfinder also happens to have published my favorite campaign of all time, which is the Iron Gods Adventure Path. And I've talked about that particular set of adventures on the channel before, so maybe I'll link my comment on that. There's a video I did on that during the RPG A Day series of videos, and it's just a very cool sci-fi, science fantasy setting that I love. So knowing that 2nd edition Pathfinder was going to be coming out in August of this year, and then play tested for a year, and then published again, it got me thinking, like, you know what? If I'm going to run Iron Gods, why don't I just do that? You know, do that before the new edition comes out, because Iron Gods incorporates a lot of the material and the concepts that were introduced later in the Pathfinder game cycle, in particular, like the technology guide, the gunslinger class. And I know it sounds like there's going to be some easy conversion from one version to the other, but this was originally written for original version, or the original edition of Pathfinder, so why not just use that? One of the other factors that played in was I started listening to the Glass Cannon podcast, which, if you have not listened to it yet, I strongly recommend it as a extraordinarily entertaining podcast. It's a bunch of guys who are around my age who play Pathfinder, playing through the Giant Slayer Adventure Path. And the Giant Slayer Adventure Path is something, again, I own as well, and I enjoyed. And it was very, very cool hearing how they played Pathfinder. And the way that they played the game was very similar to how I run most of my games, which is to say that I take my sweet time with it. I don't feel the need to rush through the material. I let there be lots of role playing. I do lots of filling of descriptive detail and stuff like that. And it sounded like a shit ton of fun, to be honest. I mean, like they made the game sound really, really fun, and also much more playable. And it helped highlight a lot of the nitty details about the Pathfinder system that I had written off as being unnecessary. I thought it was silly, and that it was better to just run a more streamlined cinematic game, the kind of game I normally run, like Savage Worlds or Genesis or Shadow the Demon Lord, things like that, or Cypher. But I decided to give it another look, and the final reason I started thinking about Pathfinder again was because of playing in my buddy Jason Hobbs's game. He runs a BX D&D, so the basic expert, the Moldvay version of D&D campaign that's a sandbox, and it is a purely sandbox. There is a history to the world. There's a world that reacts to you, but it is not in favor of the heroes. You are not part of a story where you are the hero in it. You are going to go and do stuff, and the world may fuck you over. The way the dice fall, both in terms of how things work out in combat and what comes up on your random encounters, you're just stuck with that shit. If you go somewhere where there are monsters that are way above your punching weight, you're going to die, and then you're going to roll new characters, and then hopefully you're not going to repeat that same mistake. And that kind of merciless play was interesting to me for one reason, because I generally don't play that way. But more to the point, I was interested in how it made me approach the game. We spent almost an entire day where a bunch of us were going back and forth in this Google Plus Hangout, or this Google Hangout, where we were planning what we were going to do, asking questions, doing some research, looking on the shared Google Plus community or Google Hangouts community to see where what other people have gone to plan where we wanted to go, do a little bit of role playing, and it was so much fun. And it also made us engage with the world. We were trying to figure out who we could talk to and stuff like that. And I realized that by tracking all of those little nitty-gritty details like encumbrance and things like that, that made it feel more real to me. And Pathfinder is a very simulationist game, I think, in that sense, in the sense that it has lots of ways to make you feel present in that game. And don't get me wrong, it's still a role-playing game, and it's still a very game. There's still a lot of gamey elements to it, like the weird idea of there being different levels of things like that. But listening to the Glass Cannon podcast made me realize that that the level aspects that can bring you out of the story does not have to be foremost in your mind. You can just immerse yourself and assume that the stuff that you're going to be encountering in your story, in your game, is going to be around the level, and it won't feel weird. But all those other little things, like the idea of there being a world out there that that isn't a fan of you, that will let you fail, and that has a set of rules that everybody, the good guys, the bad guys, the neutral guys, all of them are subject to those same rules. And I really love that, and that reminded me of the things I loved about the game that Jason had run for me, the BX game. So with all that stuff in mind, I decided that I really wanted to run Iron Gods. I really wanted to switch everything over. So I talked to the guys about it and said out what was going to happen. And we are coming up in a couple of months for our annual gaming marathon. Once a year, for those listening may not be familiar with this, but once a year we get together all in person, or most of us in person, in my hometown of Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. And we play role-playing games for about 16 hours or 17 hours straight. And the last couple of years, we've streamed it as well, too. So last year, we played Conan. The year before that, we played Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing 3rd Edition. And they're fucking great sessions, like really, really fun. And because that was going to be a big session, I thought that we should try and wrap up the campaign before that, have it done, and then maybe use that session to start playing Iron Gods, or to do that, to play something different, just to cleanse our palates, as it were, and then dive into, Iron Gods after that session. So I knew that we were about 2 months or so off from wanting to wrap things up. So I sat down and then started hammering out all the story beats. Oh, there's one other thing that I forgot too. So after I kind of decided I wanted to run Pathfinder, I really dove back into my adventure paths as well too, and I started reading them, all the ones I have, and I picked up a couple of new ones as well. And they're great. I mean, like, if you're not familiar with the Pathfinder adventure paths, even if you don't run the system, they're a lot of them. Not necessarily all of them, but a lot of them, and most of them, I'd even say, have great stories in them, great encounters, and they're a really great example of how to focus on a sort of single theme and run a series of really fun stories based around that theme to transition the characters from lower level to higher level. And reading through those made me recognize that where the Pathfinder adventure paths, for the most part, do a great job of transitioning you with one cohesive story from your first level up to the max level, which is usually between 16th and 18th level. And you contrast that with the Scales of War one, which is just a fucking mess, where like things aren't consistent. Things were written without an idea of what the final game was going to be. And I realized also, so the games that I thought were so great, even a Siege of Borderlands Watch, it's a really great 4th edition D&D game, but that's it. It does not age particularly well. Some of the broader story ideas are pretty fun in it, but that set piece that I love so much was a great set piece for 4th edition D&D. It would be not as good and not as enjoyable for Shadow of the Demon Lord. So I'd already started making some changes to that, and then I decided, all right, I'm going to set myself an end target here. Our characters were 5th level. I think they might be 6th level right now. I think they're 6th level right now, and they are 6th level. And there's only 10 levels in Shadow of the Demon Lord, so that meant I wanted to do 5 more sessions. And after each session, they're going to gain a level. So they will be 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and at 10th level, that 10th level adventure is going to be our big wrap up. That setting that deadline provided a really good structure for me and a good incentive for me to figure out what the hell the story is going to be about and to focus on what had happened so far. And I think I have a good idea now. I don't mean good idea. I know what I want to have happen in the campaign and what's going to happen over those next sessions. So when I say good idea, I think it'll be a fun sort of way of resolving things. Whether it works out that way, things always tend to last or take a lot longer than what I anticipate they're going to do. So it's going to take a little bit of discipline on my part to make sure things are moving along to get us done with this session in the next 20 hours of gameplay that we have before us. So so that is where we are and where we're going. And that's the reason or my reasons for why I wanted to make the transition. Shadow of the Demon Lord has proved to be a really, really great choice for us. And I think that when we are finished with Iron Gods, I would strongly consider going back to do something different with Shadow of the Demon Lord, because it is such a good game. And in particular for running an accelerated game. I have actually played through a game that my buddy Jared Rasher ran for me, where we played from level 0 to level 10. So I've seen the full cycle of Pathfinder or of characters in Shadow of the Demon Lord from the player side, and it was a ton of fun. Even though we only played 11 sessions, which was about 33 hours of gameplay, I will always remember and love my character from that campaign. So, and part of it is because you get to see the characters advance so much. So the last thing I want to mention is that I knew I was going to record this tonight, and I knew I wanted to record the 2 different things. And then shortly before I got home from work, I got an email from one of my players, and he was a player. It was James, actually, who plays Ember. And James had mentioned that James was a dyed-in-the-wool 4th edition fan, and that's what he joined us to play. That's why he wanted to play in that campaign. James hadn't been playing in our Star Wars campaign, hadn't been playing in our Dragon Age campaign, hadn't been playing in our Iron Kingdoms campaign. But 4th edition was something that brought him back. And I was quite worried about making the transition to Shadow of the Demon Lord, because I didn't want to lose him as a player. James is a good friend of mine, and we've known each other for many, many years. So I didn't want to lose him as a player. Unfortunately, the transition was smooth. And one of the things he said in his email, and it was really sort of a, looking back and looking forward kind of thing, talking about what we've played so far, what's happened in the campaign, and what he's looking forward to with Iron Gods. And it was, I won't talk about the stuff relating to Pathfinder, but what he had said is that one of the things he particularly enjoyed about this was seeing the characters advance so quickly. Seeing the characters go from level, because we transitioned them over at level 3, and they've gone from level 3 to level 6 already in the course of a handful of sessions. And now in 5 more sessions, they'll go right through to end game. And one of the things he said was that it was great seeing the characters go beyond that theory crafting. You weren't just building characters that you were never going to see, hit the table. And I think there's a really good lesson to be learned there, that picking a time to end a campaign, knowing when that's going to be the end point, that's really helpful for the players to figure out what sort of, when they're going to be done with that character, when they're going to say goodbye to that character. But also see it running an accelerated leveling thing is great. Like, I understand why this might be a problem. I think running 20 sessions, going a level up per level with Pathfinder might be a problem because the characters are commensurately more complex in Pathfinder than they are in Shadow of the Demon Lord. They're not simplistic by any means in Shadow of the Demon Lord, but you're not tracking 5 or 8 pages worth of spells in Shadow of the Demon Lord. Your most complex character is going to be maybe 3 or 4 pages, right? So it's just not going to be the overwhelming bookkeeping that's going to kill you. But for Shadow of the Demon Lord, man, like I would really think about doing just an 11 session campaign next time, because it was great, and the players seem to really enjoy and really get into designing and leveling up their characters. And that gets back to what I said, I guess, about the encumbrance and all those little nitty-gritty things. By making leveling a regular part of the game, I saw players engaging with the mechanics aspect of Shadow of the Demon Lord who had not demonstrated that level of interest with a lot of the other games we played, and other games that were probably simpler. The games where they would be happy to let someone who was more of a a math nerd or someone who's more of a gamist kind of theory crafter, let them just build their character for them, and then they would just play them at the table. So that's been really, it's been really interesting to learn that. I want to make sure I don't forget that lesson, and make sure that I make leveling and developing your character in Iron Gods as present and as important a part of the game, so that the players will engage with the rules of the game in a more meaningful way. So anyway, I sort of degenerated into a little bit of navel gazing about gaming in general there at the end. So you'll have to forgive me for digressing, but it is a Thursday night, and I can feel the breath of the weekend breathing down my neck, so I cannot wait for that. I'm clearly a little excited for it, and for our next session in the Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign. So anyway, I hope that has given you a good idea of what's happened in the Scales of War campaign to date, both at the table and behind the screen. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns regarding what I've talked about here, please don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section below, and I will endeavor to respond in a timely fashion, as always. If you are interested in seeing what's going to happen in the Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign, then please tune in tomorrow night, or just, if you're watching this at another date, click on the next video, because that will be the next session for Shadow of the Demon Lord, or for Scales of War, I should say. And then, yeah, it's you can, if you're just tuning into this campaign at this point, we got 5 sessions left, so you can join us for the countdown to the end of this campaign, when we say goodbye to our 6 heroes who we met at the outset of this video. So anyway, thank you as always for listening. For those of you who post any comments, thank you very much for posting those as well. I always love hearing from folks, whether it's constructive criticism or otherwise. I should say too, I recently had a posting from someone talking about one of the tics that I have when I speak, and it's something I'm aware of and something I've been working on. You may have noticed if you watched any of my videos, I tend to use filler sounds like or an awful lot. It's something I've done for years and years and years, and it's something I have when I'm not working from a script. It's something that infects my speech, and doing this process of posting to the channel on a regular basis has given me an opportunity to hear that and for that irritant to try and fix on it. In the past, I've had some really mean comments posted about that have not been constructive at all. But recently, I had someone post something that was basically the same thing. You know, stop saying ers or ums or things like that. But it was presented in a really constructive way, and I really, really appreciate that. So the reason I wanted to bring that up was not to, draw my verbal tick to your attention and ruin the rest of my videos for you. It was to suggest that even if you have non-positive constructive feedback for us on the channel, I still really appreciate hearing that. Any way that we can make the channel better and more interesting for the viewers, any way that it will improve the way that I run games or the way that I think about games, I would definitely appreciate that. And from people pointing out my mistakes too. If there's things that have gone wrong in a session that I didn't recognize, or something happens that I misjudged or whatnot too, I love hearing from folks for that too. One of our regular viewers has actually recently posted some good, actually several viewers, constructive feedback on one of our Traveler sessions that was not one of our best. Things didn't quite click that session, and some of the viewers had some really helpful suggestions for how to fix that. And we've taken those suggestions and implemented them into that campaign, and it has really helped with the enjoyment of that campaign and how all the players, the two players and myself, interact with that game. So anyway, again, if positive or negative, as long as it's constructive feedback, I really appreciate hearing, not just positive glad handing. So anyway, I will cut this video off here because I have to do some final preparations for tomorrow's session to try my very best to kill off some 6th level heroes. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this educational, and I hope this primes you to join us for the last 5 sessions of Scales of War. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon.